So I guess we're just wandering around until we find something, because we just walked that entire direction that we were told to go. Drakkhen on the Super Nintendo. I mentioned this game once before when I reviewed its sequel, Dragon View, that really the only thing wrong with that game was that it was trying to be a sequel to this game. And while I will freely admit it had been forever since I played Drakkhen, having played it again, I still stand by that. Now the story follows your team of predetermined 4 people, a warrior, a priestess, a wizard, and I guess a thief. They call him a scout. I'm gonna say he's a thief. Your generic D&D team, as they go on a quest to try and conquer the islands of Drakkhen, which is basically a land ruled by half humans, half dragons, who have basically been put on this Erath to be sort of the avengers of dragons being slain by humans long ago. Basically, they exist to try and wipe out humanity, to be their next step of evolution, because humanity inadvertently wiped out all the dragons. And your team is humanity's last chance to try and save the world. Except that you're kind of completely lost out of the gate. Yeah, that's sort of the biggest issue I find with this game. Don't get me wrong, I have lots of problems with this game, but the biggest one is just out of the gate, it is really wildly unclear what you're supposed to do. Don't get me wrong, they basically say, okay, see that castle on the horizon? That's where you go first. And then I went through that castle, and that was confusing on its own right, we'll talk about that in a sec. And then I completed that castle and found the guy who was in charge, and he said go somewhere else, at which point I followed his exact directions and ended up running into this randomly spawning NPC who kept telling me, you're not allowed to go past here yet because you're not strong enough. And then I checked the map and was completely confused because the map has no discernible landmarks to really follow aside from the locations of the individual inns and the dungeons. Yeah, the map in this game is not good whatsoever, nor is the actual overworld, because it is, while very bleeding edge in terms of technological design, and I'm pretty sure this game does not feature the Super Effects chip, so it's achieving this sort of 3D world design purely on Awesome Mode 7-ness, but it immediately felt dated the moment it came out. Again, bleeding edge, it's kind of comes with the territory, but also unlike its sequel, which at least had walls to surround you to sort of guide you to sort of all the different locations in the world, this one is entirely flat, relying on basically just markers on the ground itself, which largely blends in with every other thing that's just painted on the ground. Finding your way around this world is not easy, it is overly confusing, and that's all while dealing with random travelers stopping you every few minutes, random encounters with enemies, as well as pre-planned encounters with enemies that might exist because you bumped into a bit of scenery and suddenly this giant dog head spawns on top of you because they protect graves, I guess? And then they murder you. Did I mention this game wasn't very clear? That's a pretty consistent theme with this game, honestly. Since we're still on the world map, let's talk about combat for a little bit, and I gotta point out how little I care for combat. Now, again, it might be because I've played the sequel, which was, again, awesome in pretty much all respects, especially its combat, but this one does combat wholly and absolutely 100% wrong, because it's entirely on autopilot. Yep, congratulations, you inspired Final Fantasy XIII. Awesome. Here's the thing, you got a team of 4 people, and trying to control all of them with one controller would probably be pretty unreasonable. However, even just the one character, which you can swap as being like your main playable character, while you can control their on-screen movement, you can't actually decide when they attack your opponent, and in fact you can actually turn off your control entirely so they'll just awkwardly stumble around like all the other characters on your team, hoping they might swing their sword at your opponents, at which point your equipment might awkwardly be unequipped for some reason, or yes, entirely be destroyed for reasons, again, that aren't really explained aside from a text box saying, yep, what you had equipped is no longer equipped. Good job. Again, wildly unclear, and again, combat is entirely a crapshoot simply because it's when your characters decide to attack that they choose to attack, and sometimes they just don't. They just mash their face into the enemy and get their face bitten off. And the enemy AI isn't necessarily all that much better. I ran into a situation where I basically just had to sit there and either run, which the game wouldn't let me do. Don't get me wrong, there is a run command, but for whatever reason, I guess I was too low level to run from a specific fight I ran into or something, and I couldn't really fight them, so I basically just had to sit there and wait for them to kill me. I sat there for probably at least a good 5 minutes before I was killed, just because the enemy, I guess, had wildly inaccurate attacks or something. It was very strange, and I ran into situations where I'm not sure I was necessarily being attacked, but the game wasn't wildly clear about it. Again, it was a moment where they spawned an NPC on top of my team, and they would proceed to yell at my team almost as if they were trying to get me to go away and like attack me or something. And in fact, it looked like the NPC I was dealing with was like trying to swing at my characters, or at least randomly swinging in the air, except my characters wouldn't attack them and they wouldn't lose health, and I just had to sort of leave. Again, this game is not good at telling you stuff. And I guess now that we're sort of in the castle dungeon area aspect of the game, we should talk about the castle areas of the game, which are conceptually kind of interesting, but again, unclear and not well done. The first castle involves you basically going and talking to the first of the Drakkhen Lord guys, who is more or less just entirely happy to see you and gives you like a mini quest himself. Okay, so this guy's a friend, except to get to this point, I had to go through traps that were designed to kill people, as well as fight hostile NPCs, which told me to leave this guy alone and never see him. So, am I trespassing? Am I supposed to be here? Are you an ally? This is just wildly unclear, but there were some really neat aspects about it too. For example, if you see a shield or any weapons just hanging around on the wall, you can select them and equip them, which is a good way to get some early equipment, I suppose, provided they don't, like, disappear from your inventory and break, I guess, because again, the game isn't clear on that either. And there's a neat system where you can separate your party, apparently, and have them in different areas of the game, and I think that could be very interesting. I didn't run into any situations like this. Again, I played for a very limited amount of time simply by virtue of I was very rushed this week, as well as, honestly, I was having trouble just figuring out what I was supposed to do, where I was supposed to go, and why. But this idea could very much be implemented in having characters in different parts of the individual dungeons to solve grander puzzles from different locations all at once. Now again, I don't think this game actually does this, and I certainly didn't run into it, but it's an interesting idea all the same, just not well executed. Another weird thing, and another example of the game simply not explaining things all that well, is running into keys in dungeons, because you need keys to open locked doors. That's pretty typical for these sorts of games. And likewise, you have to go through the game's clumsy, ye olde RPG menu of having to select a pickup command to pick up a key. Now that's okay, bit of a side tangent, but the menus in this game are terrible. I've seen tons of games that have these sorts of menus, but this one just feels overly clumsy, and like for whatever reason, all the in-game menus automatically default you to leave the menu instead of, you know, finish, which is terrible. Seriously, if you want to make a well-designed menu, try and figure out the minimal number of inputs necessary to get from point A, which is I need to equip or use something, to point B, which is I'm doing that and playing the game again. Because having as many inputs in between starting a menu and leaving it to actually play the game is not good. You want as few of those as possible, because you're just detracting from the actual gameplay with menu management. But aside from the overly slow, clunky, and convoluted menus that really shouldn't be like that at all, the game requires you to make inputs in the menu in order to interact with bits of environment. Now that's all well and good, I'm fine with that. But what's weird is the game will just use keys without telling you. So you have to go through and actively specify, okay, there's a key, I want that, but then the game will just secretly say, okay, you use the key, without explaining that you used the key. In fact, at one point I thought I just sort of weirdly dropped the key because I figured I needed to go through my menu to access and open a door, which apparently I didn't, but still. This game just... it feels like it has an idea, and it feels like it has several other concepts it wants to utilize, but none of them are really all that thought through, and certainly none of them are really explained to the character. The only real gameplay explanation you get is like a 15-minute long button mash tutorial of going through menus, of having things explain to you exactly what certain icons do. That's not clever. That's a front-loaded tutorial that really doesn't teach the player anything, simply by virtue of it's not expecting any sort of input to show you understand what you're doing and why you'd be doing it. It's just a lesson in reading in a moment that just makes it really, really boring. Again, this game starts off terribly, and I can see why it would totally dissuade a lot of people from playing it, because congratulations game, you did that to me too. Now the overall presentation to Drakkhen is kinda hit or miss. Like I said, visually, for the time, the overworld was pretty bleeding edge, but the problem with bleeding edge technology is from the moment it's released, it's automatically dated, because the things that stick to the good old tried and true are gonna hold up a lot better. In case in point, look at any other Final Fantasy, or really any other game minus like the Super Effects games, and even them kind of hold up a little bit better. And you can kind of see that this game, at least in terms of its overworld, looks really, really dated. That said, there are some things that really impress me. The giant dragon on the title screen, that's damn impressive. Also, it shoots lasers out of its eyes that spell text, and, you know, that's pretty stylish, I'll give you that. The giant sprites and enemies, they're actually pretty well done, as are the characters. They're pretty well animated as well. And the environments, at least the castles, are decent. And there's ways to interact with the sort of visual design of the game a little bit, in that you can take stuff off walls, you can take torches and create a brighter interior. There's lots there that is actually really well done. But then you get that overworld map and it just looks immediately very, very clumsy. And then of course you have the audio design, which, don't get me wrong, I really like the overworld theme to this game, but other than that, there's like no music. And I don't mean that disingenuously. The moment you enter a fight, like all music disappears from this game, which just comes across as weird and bad. Certainly not very interesting, leading to an overall presentation of, at best, average. Now, if you want a copy of Drakkhen on the Super Nintendo, cheapest one I'm seeing right now is $11 with free shipping. And that still seems a wee bit high. I'd probably pay no more than $5 for this one because it's got a lot of issues. But I do have to give a big shout out and thank you to my girlfriend for sending this to the show. I know she was really excited about this because she loves dragons, and there are a lot of dragons in here. It's just the game around them that isn't quite as good. And it's a shame too, because it did spawn an excellent sequel that I think is an absolute must play, except that game is wildly hard to find and expensive. But I reviewed it and I can tell you, it's really that good. Unfortunately, this one, not so much. It feels very technologically advanced for the time, but it also feels very dated for the time. And again, it's just terrible at explaining anything, which leads pretty much everyone to be in the dark. And don't get me wrong, you can figure out what you're supposed to do after a while, but by the time you're already in the dark, and you're already stumbling around these lands getting eaten by giant dogs and stars that murder you from falling out of the sky, because that was another thing I remember about this game. There's just so much you should not have to just wander through and trial and error try and figure out what this game's trying to do with you. And unfortunately, the Isles of Drakkhen will always remain a mystery simply by virtue of not really explaining themselves all that well. And the thing about mysteries and solving puzzles and going on grand adventures is seeking out the truth, seeking out the answers, and understanding the world around you, and this one does not provide that. Okay, let's do it again. Uh-oh. Alas, the Drakkhen Islands spread and dragons fill the skies. Towns and palaces are razed and humans suffer. The rage of the terrible troops. Game over. Yeah, and, well, I think that's Drakkhen.